Okay, that was a whirlwind, and it could not have been a more substantive tee-up for our first panel this morning. I had suggested to you that the first panel would take on broad issues. They're both issues that were touched upon by Senator Warner. The panel will be, discussion will be led by Dr. Rob Shapiro, who's behind me, and Professor J. Bradford Jensen. I'm sorry, Robert. These are both my dear friends, and I've butchered their names. I'm sorry. But we'll have Rob Shapiro and Brad Jensen, each of whom will speak for about 10 minutes with the idea that, that there will be time for kicking things around after their talks. So let me turn it over to them.
Pleasure to be here, and though I have to say, Senator Warner took a lot of my points, but that's fine. This session is titled Practical Solutions in a Polarized World, and my job is to identify those practical solutions in macroeconomic policy. Of course, the central issues of our current ideological conflict and partisan deadlock have been and remain matters of macroeconomic policy. So the era when we could debate a change in tax rates or an initiative like an infrastructure bank in terms of how it would affect economic resources and growth, well, that era is not the current one. My first non-academic job was legislative assistant, first for the Senate Budget Committee and then for Senate Finance for Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So I've been where a lot of you guys have been, are now. Partisanship was just as hard-edged then as it is today, but it wasn't ideological. The conservative and liberal leanings of the two parties were dispositions, not inalterable views. The Democrats had some pretty conservative members, and the Republicans had real liberals. Because they didn't define themselves ideologically, compromise was always possible, especially on issues which had to be resolved or the country would suffer real costs, like the expiration of a tax rate structure or raising the debt limit. What's changed politically, I think, and I'm not going to talk about politics today except for this one sentence, is that one of the two great parties has become quite ideological. And while much of its leadership would like to operate from a partisan platform that seeks compromise, enough members to control them appear to prefer fealty to ideology over results. This is how great nations go off course or over the cliff. So in this context, how do we come up with practical solutions? Given what I've said, I'm going to set aside the political considerations and just talk about what the economy needs. First of all, as the senator said, we need a budget deal. Let me be clear about the economics of this. We need to take steps to rebuild our tax base and slow the growth of entitlements. We did exactly this in the 1980s. We did exactly this again in the 1990s. Global investors believe we're going to do it again, which is why U.S. long-term interest rates remain at historically low levels. You get paid 2% to lend for 10 years. That said, that is a global vote of confidence in our ability to address these things. So we need a deal that's significant enough to confirm that confidence, though not one that necessarily solves the whole problem. We need to demonstrate, rather, our continuing capacity to make progress. And we need to prove that we take seriously America's responsibility as the nation whose currency is the medium for global reserves by passing the ministerial legislation that raises the legal debt limit. There would be no clearer demonstration of our having lost our political capacity for leadership than to make that authority hostage to a political or ideological argument. As to the content of a budget deal, economically, I'm here to tell you that economically, it doesn't really matter much. Higher income tax rates on the wealthy would have much less adverse economic effects than failing to restore the tax base. But compared to other groups, the macroeconomy is fairly indifferent as to whether the income taxes come from the very wealthy, the well-to-do, the middle class, frankly, or even the poor. These are matters of social policy and politics, not macroeconomics. Macroeconomics says, get the revenues. Nor does the macroeconomy care much in terms of overall investment, consumption, growth, or employment, whether the spending cuts come out of Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, or the national parks. Different sectors and businesses care. But what the overall economy cares about here is that something substantial and reasonable gets done. Let me mention some other things that could shake or bolster the economy. The first is the European sovereign debt crisis. This poses a real danger to the economy, but not because a collapse of Greek, Spanish, or Italian sovereign debt would infect confidence in U.S. debt. That is, that we're going to be Greece. Quite the opposite. It actually would send tens of billions of euros, yen, and renminbi, once converted to dollars, to the United States as a safe haven. But such a crisis would threaten the solvency of many of the most important banks, not only in Greece, Spain and Italy, but also in Germany and France. And that would threaten contagion because our banks are linked very closely with institutions such as Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank or Crédit Agricole and Paribas. These are among the biggest banks in the world. Through thousands of deals and other transactions, cross-ownership of each other's corporate bonds, credit default swaps guaranteeing those bonds, as well as guaranteeing the sovereign bonds. So here's a practical step. The Treasury and the Fed should conduct new stress tests of all large U.S. financial institutions to establish how each of them could weather a broad European banking crisis. Such a public accounting would help insulate us from the shock of a Eurozone debt meltdown if it occurs and ensure that our financial institutions can withstand it. The second thing this economy needs, in certain respects, is to be left alone. For the first time since 2007, the elements for a strong expansion are actually in place. Not only is business sitting on about $2 trillion in cash that it could invest or use to hire workers, more important, household debt as a share of income, debt service as a share of income, the ratio of household debt to household assets, they've all returned to normal levels. The deleveraging process triggered by the crisis is largely over, so people are prepared to spend again. That's particularly true because the value of the single most important asset for more than half of Americans, which is their houses, has stopped falling and in most places has begun to rise again. So for a start, we need to do nothing that could upend the housing market right now. If anybody has their eye on the home mortgage deduction, as a macroeconomist, please wait another year or two. The other thing holding back a strong expansion is everyone's recent experience from 2010 and 2011, when the economy gathered strength and then petered out. I believe there were good reasons in both of those cases, especially falling housing prices and a continuing drive by people to draw down their debts relative to their assets. But those reasons no longer apply. There's hesitation out there by businesses about investing and hiring, and by households about how much more they can spend without getting nervous. So the economy could use a little push. That's what the Fed is trying to provide through QE3. That's what the president is trying to do through proposals for more stimulus this year, like a $50 billion in the new infrastructure bank. As an economist, I would like to see a little more stimulus. But an amicable resolution of the fiscal cliff and debt ceiling issues might well be enough to support a much stronger expansion than most people now expect. This also tells us that as we try to make progress reforming the tax code and the entitlement system, we need to be careful about phasing in those measures as the economy gathers strength. That means no significant cuts in 2013. Finally, we need to recognize two new issues in the macroeconomy. Before the current slow recovery and before the financial meltdown and the deep recession which preceded it, certain new dynamics had appeared in the expansion of 2002 to 2007. First, the rate at which American businesses created jobs in response to economic growth and demand fell by more than half. In the 6 years of that expansion, our businesses created about 6 million jobs. In the first 6 years of the 1990s expansion, when we adjusted for the growth in the 2002-2007 expansion, we created 13 to 15 million new jobs. There's more. The rate at which wages and salaries increase in response to productivity growth also is changing. In the 1990s, productivity grew at an average annual rate of 2.5% a year, and wages and salaries rose at an average rate of 2.2% a year. By those measures, productivity grew about 3% a year in the expansion of 2002 to 2007, and wages and salaries stagnated. They disengaged, those two factors. If we look at wage and salary gains by age cohorts and look at what happened to people's incomes as they got older and aged through the expansion, the contrast is even greater. Tracking those income gains, we saw income growth in the 1990s expansion that averaged 3.6% per year across age cohorts as they aged, as we had seen gains of about 3.2% a year across wage cohorts as they aged in the 1980s expansion. That was normal. In the expansion of 2007, that rate fell to 0.5% a year across age cohorts. The fiscal cliff is a political challenge, but this is the real economic challenge we're facing. It requires new thinking about how to reduce the cost to businesses of creating new jobs, maybe through employer-side payroll tax cuts, stricter measures to slow the rate of increase in healthcare costs of businesses. We need new ways to improve workers' skills, perhaps with free access to IT training at community colleges for any adult. We need new efforts, as the senator said, to intensify innovation and accelerate business creation. Those are practical problems, and there are practical responses for the macroeconomy. All we need is a politics capable of recognizing it. Thank you.
I think we have time for a couple of questions for Rob.
You want to do that before Brad?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
The statistics you cite with regards to growth productivity and growth wages would seem to say that the problem isn't necessarily a function of training new workers. It's getting businesses to invest in their workers and then pay their workers for those investments. And that seems to then move back to the statement you made at the beginning, which that from a macroeconomic point of view, we don't care where the tax revenues come from. It can come from the poor, it can come from the wealthy. And from a macroeconomic point of view, it doesn't seem to make much difference. But wouldn't instead the statistics at the end argue that the elasticities for the poor and the wealthy are significantly different, since the multiplier effect would be different for the different cohorts?
It's a different problem.
Okay.
What I'm discussing in the beginning is the need to assure global investors of our capacity to address a large long-term fiscal problem, which is kind of the basic capacity of government. And in that respect, and with respect to over the short term growth, investment, consumption, the macroeconomy is going to respond basically the same way. Whether we get it through tax rates on the wealthy or whether we got it through, a new sales tax. That's not to say there aren't long-term differences, but with respect to the practical problem we face today, that's the essence of the problem. One other point. even though productivity rose at a very rapid rate in the last expansion, there's a lot of evidence that it was not even, that it was that it was fairly concentrated in the top third of the labor force. This again is a labor force that tends to have more IT skills, and I emphasize IT skills because IT has now and continues to permeate every part of the economy. And in 10 years, I don't think you'll be able to do any job in the economy without at least being comfortable in a work environment dense with information technologies. And so this has really become a new basic requirement for getting employed in the U.S. economy.
Time for another question.
Joe Miller from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. I struggle with looking at the impact of rising inequality, especially among African Americans and Latinos in the United States, and not being ideological. Can you provide some context there? To what extent do you think it's appropriate to consider those factors without being ideological?
Look, I think social policy matters. And the parties have big divides on social policy. I'm a Democrat, but I think it matters. I was speaking macroeconomically. Now, as to the question, and perhaps this is behind your question of, is there a point at which inequality begins to have macroeconomic consequences, begins to actually affect how efficiently the economy operates? There is new evidence that that may very well be true. It's a question economists have not asked themselves before. But I will give you one example of the way in which it has affected this business cycle. In 2007, this is not racial inequality, but that is not inequality based on race, but more just in income. In 2007, before the financial crisis, 93% of the value of all financial assets were held by the top 20% of the country. The bottom 80% held only 7% of the value of all stocks, bonds, all financial assets, including pensions and retirement saving. But 44% of the value of all residential real estate was held by the bottom 80%. So the majority of the country has no financial assets. Their only asset was their home equity. And that meant that when you had a financial crisis that pulled down the value of housing, that hit two assets, financial assets and real estate assets. But the real estate assets were essentially we intervened and stabilized the financial markets. And the financial markets came back. Financial markets are back to where they were before the crisis. We spent trillions of dollars doing this. We did very little for the housing market to stabilize the housing market. That had social consequences. And the inequalities in the different distributions of those assets meant that the middle class was unwilling to spend, was forced to deleverage over a very extended period, and that's why the recovery has been so slow, and that's why the recovery petered out once the stimulus petered out. So inequality can, in fact, have a significant effect. It had a significant effect on the shape of this business cycle. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the best I have on those issues.
Time for one final question. Gone. Let me give a proper introduction to Brad Jensen, who is a professor of economics and international business at Georgetown University. He is the author of a book on trade and services that has gotten a lot of attention by a number of people here in Congress, and including President Obama. So let me introduce Brad Jensen, who will talk about international trade.
Thanks, John. So I was glad to hear Senator Warner talk about trade as a key element in trying to jumpstart our economy. Delighted to hear that. However, I would take issue with, I mean, his list is fine, but I think the most important element of a trade policy to jumpstart our economy was missing from his list. And I like to add liberalizing trade and services. I think that should be the top element of a trade policy agenda going forward. And let me try to take the next 10 minutes to persuade you why. Okay, so I think most people would readily acknowledge that the US is a service economy, right? We say, depending on how you measure it, it could be 80% of employment. If take a more narrow definition, it could be 50% of employment. But we're predominantly a services economy. Yet as soon as we start to talk about trade, we all go to how trade policy is going to help resuscitate the American manufacturing sector. So I think that emphasis is misplaced. If you think about employment, the structure of employment in the United States, the manufacturing sector now only accounts for 10% of employment. Okay? The service sector, broadly defined, is 80%. That's too big to talk about analytically. So what I like to do in my 10 minutes is focus on a sub-segment of the service economy, which I'm going to call business services. This is what the statisticians, the government statisticians, classify in the North American Industrial Classification System industries in the 50s. It's the information sector, which includes publishing, importantly software publishing. It includes media, so movies, sound recordings, includes telecommunications and internet-related things. That's information. Finance, insurance, it includes professional, scientific, and technical industries, so think architects, accountants, attorneys, engineers. And it includes administrative support activities. Okay, so that's what I'm going to call business services. Now, you may say that I'm cherry picking because I'm going to talk about how good these jobs are. You may say, well, you're cherry picking, right? How big could that business service sector be? Well, in terms of employment, it's 25% of employment in the United States. So it's 2.5 times the size of the manufacturing sector in terms of employment. Okay, in addition, these jobs pay average wages that are 20% higher than average wages in the manufacturing sector. So there's a big sector. Over the 10 years prior to the financial crisis, employment in this sector expanded almost 30%. In contrast, employment in the manufacturing sector shrank about 20%. Okay, so I think that this is where the future of our economy is. And I still think, even though I say this, I don't think people carry around the right image in their mind of what our economy looks like. So let me just talk about a couple specific industries. So we heard a lot in the political campaign about the automobile industry. It's a big, important industry, right? So NAICS Industries 3361, 3362, and 3363, which is automobile parts and assembly, right, employs about 910,000 people. Okay, engineering services, NAICS 541330, right? How important could that be? Engineering services. Okay, it employs 980,000 people. More people than the automobile industry. Okay, it's significantly higher wages. Okay, aerospace is another big important industry that we talk a lot about. Aerospace employs about 440,000 people. Okay, if instead I looked at computer systems design, it employs 1.25 million people, 3 times the size of the aerospace sector. Okay, so again, I think people don't have the right picture in their head of what the U.S. economy looks like. So I think there are big opportunities here. Okay, it's a big sector, it's a high wage sector, it's already growing. Okay, question is this stuff tradable? Official statistics are terrible. The official statistics on services trade are just nowhere near as robust as they are in the manufacturing sector for goods. So for example, goods trade is about 70% of US exports. we have 10,000 categories. For the 30% of US exports that are services, we have 30 categories. Okay, so there's a huge mismatch in the data that's available to researchers. So a big part of this book was trying to identify a methodology to identify what's tradable and what's not. I won't bore you with that, but what comes out is, I think, a pretty robust characterization at a very detailed level of what's traded within the United States and thus tradable internationally. Okay, and what you see is when you add up the employment in these tradable business services, there's more employment in tradable business services than in the entire manufacturing sector. Okay, so it's potentially a really big deal. Okay, not only is it, so that's one interesting factoid. The other interesting thing is that the workers in these tradable service activities are quite different. Okay, they're twice as likely to have a BA and twice as likely to have an advanced degree as workers in non-tradable business services or workers in the manufacturing sector. So these are really skill-intensive activities. The US is still a skill-abundant place. Okay, so comparative advantage tells us that if something is skill-intensive and some place is skill-abundant, that place will have comparative advantage in that skill-intensive thing. And indeed, the US runs a trade surplus in services. The trade surplus in services has more than doubled over the past 10 or 15 years. Okay, in stark contrast to our large, persistent deficit in goods trade. Okay, so I think that is confirming that the US has comparative advantage in these activities. Yet, in spite of comparative advantage in services, when we look at the global engagement of service firms, it lags significantly global engagement in the manufacturing sector. Okay? So if I look at the share of manufacturing plants that export, it's about 20%. I look at the share of service establishments that export, it's less than 5%. If I look at the share of output from the manufacturing sector that's exported, it's about 20%. About 1/5 of US manufacturing output is exported. In tradable business services, it's only about 4%. In an activity where we have comparative advantage. So what gives? What gives? The problem is that there are big policy impediments to services trade. Okay? The World Bank has done research trying to quantify these impediments to services trade and find that the World Bank finds the US and the EU, Canada, the historically developed economies have relatively low barriers to services trade. In stark contrast, the BRICS, particularly India, have significantly higher barriers to services trade. On the World Bank's metrics, 5, 6, 7 times higher than the US barriers to services trade. Okay, so there are big opportunities there if we could persuade the BRICS to liberalize, open their markets to US services providers. There would be big opportunities for growth in the US, and it would be a big win for those countries. They have huge development needs. They need to build out infrastructure. By some estimates, $40 trillion will be spent over the next 2 decades on infrastructure around the world. Most of that in these fast-growing developing markets. Okay, they need state-of-the-art architectural engineering, project management, logistics, telecommunications, energy provision services. We have the service firms that can provide the most cost-effective means of building out that infrastructure. It's a huge win-win, and it should be the focus of our trade policy going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. We have time for a couple of questions if you'd like. Danny?
How do you persuade the BRICS to open their market and services trade? I mean, when you're talking about the BRICS, in all the sectors you just mentioned, large numbers of them are state-owned. There's no self-interest, at least politically, for those countries to open up their markets to trade these services. And what will we give them in exchange, since our markets are that very open to services?
Yeah. So this is a big problem in a kind of traditional mercantilist trade negotiation, is that we have unilaterally liberalized. We have I mean, they're not zero. You know, if you think about being an attorney in the United States, you know, you have to pass the bar in any state you want to do business in. So it's not that we're at zero, but we are much lower than they are. So this poses a challenge. I think, you know, one way to approach it would be to, you know, pursue competitive liberalization, which would be to try to either do a big deal with the EU, you know, a coalition of the willing, and try to bring in one or two large developing markets. You know, I don't know if you think Russia or Indonesia or the Philippines or Egypt, you know, that's big enough, that has a profile like India, right, where they have a lot of, I mean, you know, reasonably set of skilled people, and they have a dysfunctional manufacturing sector, so those folks are available at kind of below global market wages. Do a deal that includes a country like that, and you may create enough trade diversion to start to put a hurt on a country like India. That might be one way to pursue it. Another is to hope that, you know, I think there was pressure building in these countries for unilateral liberalization on their part. I was in China several months ago and had the opportunity to talk to a number of government audiences. And I gave basically my stock speech off the book, which is, you know, there are big distortions in this, and the US and the EU should try to kick the door down. And I expected a fair bit of pushback from Chinese policymakers, and I was struck. I was at the Ministry of Commerce, and I was at the Development Research Council, both, I think, prominent places, and the people there said, you're absolutely right. You know, our big state-owned service firms are sucking the life out of our economy. Our big banks, our big telecom providers, our you know, the expedited delivery, all those are killing us. So I think there's growing recognition in these BRICS, you know, particularly China, that to move from commodity manufacturing to more value-added manufacturing, what's the difference between those two? It's business services. So they need to liberalize to grow. So I think there's hope in that way.
Another question right over here.
It seemed to me that maybe in the services sector you would have more issues with trade around things like language and culture and understanding regulation. How much is that affecting services trade in addition to things like policy? I mean, is that a bigger barrier to service trade than with manufacturing? Is that an issue?
Undoubtedly it is. Language and culture undoubtedly are an issue. I don't know that they're as big a deal as the policy impediments. I think, you know, there are lots of people who are bilingual, trilingual. I think cultural differences aren't that big, particularly in these types of services. You know, engineering is engineering. The laws of physics are kind of the same all over the globe. So I don't think, you know, those types of impediments loom as large in this. I mean, different regulations, so if you're thinking about accounting standards, that's an area where, you know, different systems are going to impose impediments. Whether you call that a trade impediment or whether you just call it, you know, our preference for a certain type of regulatory regime, you know, that's in the eye of the beholder. I think there's a lot of potential there for harmonization of regulatory standards, or accounting standards, that could facilitate more trade.
Okay, help me thank the panelists. Now, we are all going to be rewarded for your attention with a short, and I underscore the word short, opportunity to go to the restroom, grab a cup of coffee, ask an informal question of these panelists. We'll reconvene in about 5 minutes or so for the second panel.